They say a man's ambition in the West is a wild river, carving canyons of legacy through the land or flooding the plains with ruin. It is a force that can build an empire from dust or turn a heart to stone. On the high plains, where the sky is a canvas for God's own promises, this story was etched into the soil, a tale of a love that bloomed like a stubborn wildflower and a pride that burned hotter and more destructive than the August Sunday. It is a story that reminds us that a cage, no matter how gilded, is still a prison, and true freedom is not a place you find, but a choice you make. Before she was a name whispered on the wind, Evelyn Reed was a daughter of the soil. She was born in the Nebraska Territory in 1860, to a world of endless grass and the quiet dignity of hard work. Her father, a man with kindness etched into the lines around his eyes, had taught her to see the soul of the land. While others saw only dirt and toil, Evelyn found poetry in the dust motes, dancing in a sunbeam, and heard symphonies in the rustle of corn stalks. She was a dreamer in a world that demanded pragmatism, her heart a tender, open thing in a landscape known for its unforgiving nature. Life was a simple rhythm of sunup and sundown, of mending fences and feeding chickens. It was a life of humble truths, and Evelyn was content within it, believing love, like the crops, would grow steadily and quietly with gentle care. Then Silas Blackwood arrived, not like a gentle rain, but like a thunderstorm on a clear day. He rode into the small settlement with an air of destiny about him, a man carved from the very ambition that was taming the West. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of a winter sky, clear, cold, and assessing. He had inherited a vast tract of land to the north, and he spoke not of farming, but of building an empire of grass and cattle. His voice was a low rumble of confidence that made seasoned ranchers feel like boys, and his smile, when he chose to use it, could charm a bird from a tree. But beneath the charisma, there was a disquieting stillness. When Silas looked at the rolling hills, he didn't see the beauty that moved Evelyn's soul. He saw acreage to be conquered, resources to be claimed. He was a man at war with the wildness of the world, determined to bend it to his will. He believed legacy was not grown, but built forged in struggle and asserted with dominance. His own father, he'd once let slip, had died a broken man with nothing but debt to his name. A failure Silas was pathologically driven to erase by writing his own name across the face of the frontier. From the moment he saw Evelyn at a town gathering, he was captivated. To him, she was the final, perfect piece of the life he was constructing. She was beautiful, pure, and gentle, a symbol of the refined civilization he intended to plant in the heart of the wilderness. He saw her not as a partner in his dream, but as the most precious ornament within it. He courted her with a reverence that felt like worship. He brought her not wildflowers, but a comb carved from polished bone, its teeth fine and elegant. He gifted her a small silver locket, telling her it was to hold a picture of the future. He spoke of a grand house with glass windows, of fine dresses, and a life shielded from the harshness she had always known. Evelyn, who had only known the calloused hands of farmers, was swept away by his vision and the intensity of his focus. She mistook his possessive ambition for protective love. Her parents were wary. Her father saw the restlessness in Silas's eyes, the look of a man who would never be content. Some men build things, Evie, he warned her gently, and some men just own them. Be sure you know which kind he island. Her mother saw the glint of steel beneath the velvet of his words and prayed for her daughter's tender heart. But Evelyn was in love with the promise of Silas Blackwood. When she turned 18, they were married in the small wooden church. During the ceremony, as Silas slid the simple gold band onto her finger, his grip was firm, a silent declaration of ownership that sent a flicker of unease through her, a feeling she quickly dismissed as bridal nerves. The ink on the marriage certificate was barely dry when Silas announced his plan. They would not stay and build upon his inherited land. Instead, they would push further west, into the untamed Wyoming territory. "The land is cheaper, the grazing is untouched," he explained, his eyes alight with a feverish gleam. "We will build something from nothing, Evelyn. The Blackwood name will be synonymous with this territory. It will be our dynasty." Evelyn felt a tremor of fear mixed with a thrill of adventure. To leave everything she knew was terrifying, but to be the cornerstone of such a grand dream was intoxicating. She agreed, unaware that the first step in building her gilded cage was to isolate her completely. They set out with a small wagon, laden with supplies for a new life. The journey was arduous, a grueling crawl across a vast and indifferent landscape. It was here, on the endless trail, that the fine veneer of Silas Blackwood began to crack. One afternoon, a wagon wheel sank deep into the mud, left by a sudden downpour. The oxen strained, but the wagon wouldn't budge. Silas's frustration was a physical thing, a venom that seemed to seep from his pores. His commands to the animals grew sharp, then brutal. When Evelyn tried to offer a gentle suggestion, he turned on her, his face a mask of cold fury. "What would you know of it?" he snapped, his voice cutting like a whip. "A little more grit and a little less daydreaming is what's needed out here, Evelyn." The cruelty of his words struck her silent. She saw not the charming suitor, but a stranger with ice in his eyes. He seemed to realize he had gone too far, for his expression softened almost immediately, a practiced velvet covering the steel. "Forgive me," he murmured, stepping closer and taking her arm. His grip was too tight. "This land, it tests a man. I only want to build a world safe enough for your gentleness." He framed his anger as a consequence of his love for her, a burden he carried for her protection. Evelyn nodded, allowing herself to be soothed, but she could not forget the look in his eyes. As she watched him finally heave the wheel from the mud, his muscles straining with raw power, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. For the first time, she wondered if the empire he was so determined to build had room for a heart as soft as her own. Deep within her, where fear had never before taken root, a tiny, cold seed of dread had been planted. They settled on a sweep of land, shadowed by weathered red bluffs, a place of stark and lonely beauty. Silas chose it for the creek that cut through the valley like a silver ribbon and the vast grazing plains that stretched to the horizon. With the help of a few hired men, he raised a cabin from the land itself, its walls made of rough-hewn logs and its foundation of river stones. It was not a home, it was an outpost, the first stake driven into the heart of his future kingdom. Evelyn worked tirelessly to soften its edges. She scrubbed the dusty floors until her knuckles were raw, hung simple muslin curtains over the glassless windows, and planted a small herb garden near the door, a fragile patch of green in a world of brown and grey. She was trying to breathe a soul into the raw timbers to create a sanctuary. But the silence of the plains was immense, and the cabin often felt less like a home and more like an echo chamber for her own growing solitude. Silas was consumed by his work, riding out at dawn and returning after dusk, his talk filled with cattle counts, fence lines, and the branding iron that would sear his name onto the landscape. Then, in the quiet of that first long winter, a new life began to stir within her. The discovery was a secret, joyful warmth that she held close for days. She imagined a child's laughter filling the cabin's silence, their small hand clutching her finger. This, she thought, would be the bond that finally transformed Silas's ambition into shared joy. This would make their outpost a home. When she finally told him, he was standing by the hearth, studying a map of his land. He did not turn to her at first, his gaze fixed on the ink lines that represented his dominion. When he finally did, there was no softness in his eyes, only a new, sharp intensity. "A son," he said. It was not a hope, it was a declaration. "He will be the one to inherit all this. The Blackwood name will not die with me." From that day forward, the child was no longer theirs in his mind, it was his. He spoke of "my boy" and "the heir," as if the child's existence and gender were foregone conclusions, ordained by the same force of will with which he was taming the land. Whenever Evelyn, with a gentle smile, would suggest the possibility of a daughter, his own smile would become a thin, unyielding line. "This land demands strength, Evelyn. It needs a son to hold it," he would say, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Destiny demands it." His obsession became a suffocating pressure. He was building not a nursery, but a dynasty, and the unborn child was its cornerstone. Evelyn felt the chasm between them widen. While he saw a future heir, she felt the flutter of a tiny, unknown soul. She would walk by the creek, singing soft lullabies to the swell of her belly, whispering promises that had nothing to do with land or legacy. Promises of unconditional love, of safety, of being cherished for who they were, not what they were meant to become. The day she went into labor, a storm growled on the horizon, mirroring the tempest in her heart. The wind howled like a hungry wolf across the plains, rattling the cabin shutters. She fought through wave after wave of agony, attended only by a local midwife, Martha Hackett, an older woman with hands as worn as river stones, but a touch as gentle as moss. Silas refused to be in the room. He paced before the hearth like a caged predator, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards in a rhythm of maddening impatience. Each clap of thunder seemed to enrage him further, as if the storm itself were a personal affront to his schedule, a challenge to his control. Through the haze of pain, Evelyn heard him muttering to himself, the words distinct and chilling. "I need a son. It has to be a son." The labor dragged on for hours. Rain hammered the roof, and lightning periodically illuminated the raw timbers of the room, casting long, dancing shadows. The pain threatened to tear Evelyn in two, but she clung to the image of the child she would soon hold. At last, near midnight, her child came into the world with a piercing, healthy cry. Exhaustion washed over Evelyn in a wave of profound relief. Martha cleaned the infant and swaddled her in a soft blanket. Her tone was gentle yet weary when she turned to the triumphant mother. "You have a beautiful, healthy girl, my dear." Tears of joy streamed down Evelyn's cheeks as the midwife laid the warm, squirming bundle on her breast. She looked down at the perfect, tiny face, the tuft of dark hair, and the wide, curious eyes. It was a love so immediate and overwhelming it stole her breath. But the joy was shattered by the sound of Silas's voice. "A girl?" He stormed from the hearth to her bedside, his face a thundercloud. He stared down at the swaddled infant, not with wonder, but with a rage that was terrifyingly cold. He looked at the baby as if it were a flawed product, a failed investment. "After all this," he hissed, his voice a low tremor of contempt that made Martha recoil, "you give me a girl." Weak and trembling, Evelyn lifted her eyes, trying to calm the storm in him. "Silas, please, she's our daughter. She's perfect." Her child was perfect. Her tiny hands grasped at Evelyn's fingers, an anchor in a suddenly terrifying world. But Silas refused to touch her. He looked from the baby to Evelyn, and his eyes held a profound, chilling accusation. "This is worthless to me," he spat, the words striking Evelyn harder than any physical blow. Then he turned on his heel and stalked from the cabin, letting the heavy door slam shut behind him with a crack so violent it seemed to splinter the very air. The sound echoed the breaking of Evelyn's heart, leaving her alone in the flickering candlelight, clinging to her newborn daughter as the storm outside finally wept itself into a sorrowful silence. She looked down at the infant in her arms, a child born of hope, and in that desolate moment she named her Aurora. She would be a dawn in this dark, desolate place, a light that Evelyn now knew she would have to protect all on her own. The days that followed were suspended in a fragile, suffocating silence. Silas moved through the cabin like a ghost, haunting the edges of Evelyn's world, a phantom of cold fury. He would sit at the rough-hewn table, his coffee growing cold, and stare at the small cradle Evelyn had placed near the hearth. He didn't look at it with the wonder of a new father, but with the flat, deadened eyes of a man surveying the ruins of a dream. His presence was a weight, a constant, unspoken condemnation that pressed down on Evelyn, making it hard to breathe. Evelyn, still aching and weak from childbirth, tried to weave a semblance of normalcy from the frayed threads of their life. She moved quietly, carefully, limiting Aurora's cries so as not to provoke her husband. She cooked meals he barely touched and cleaned a house that no longer felt like a home. Each act was a prayer for peace, a desperate attempt to pretend that the chasm that had opened between them could somehow be bridged. She poured all of her love and fear into her daughter. She would whisper to Aurora in the dead of night, her voice a soft current in the sea of silence. "You are so loved," she would murmur, pressing a kiss to the baby's forehead. "You are my dawn, my beautiful girl. Don't you ever believe you are anything less." But Silas's resentment was a poison that seeped into the very timbers of the cabin. It festered, growing more venomous with each passing day. 2 weeks crawled by in this tense, suffocating state. Then, on a particularly cold evening, when the wind scraped at the walls like claws, the fragile dam of his control finally broke. It began with a small thing. Aurora, fussy from colic, let out a piercing wail that could not be immediately soothed. The sound seemed to snap something inside Silas. He slammed his fist on the table, the crack echoing like a gunshot in the small space. He began to rant, his voice rising from a low growl to a furious roar. He spoke of his cursed fortune, of the years he would now waste, waiting for a proper heir. He paced the floor, his shadow looming large and menacing in the firelight, and every word was an arrow aimed at Evelyn. "I staked everything on this land, on a son to carry my name," he raged, his eyes wild. "And you couldn't even give me that, one simple thing." Trembling, Evelyn hugged Aurora tighter to her chest, the baby's warmth a small shield against the icy storm of his words. But she would not be silent, not now. A new strength, born of a mother's fierce protective love, rose within her. "She is a gift from God, Silas," she said, her own voice shaky but clear. "We can still have a boy one day, but you must hold your daughter. You must see the miracle she island." She took a hesitant step toward him, offering the swaddled infant as a peace offering, a bridge across the chasm. His response was violence, swift and absolute. The blow to her cheek was so fast she barely saw it coming. Pain exploded across her face, a blinding flash of white-hot light. She staggered back, the taste of blood sharp and coppery in her mouth from where she'd bitten her lip. With a choked cry, she turned her body, instinctively shielding Aurora from the aftershock of the impact. Rage had twisted Silas's handsome features into something unrecognizable, a mask of pure, ugly hatred. He was no longer the man she had married. He was a monster born of pride and disappointment. "I should never have married a weak farmer's daughter," he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You are as barren and useless as this cursed land. You can't even give me a proper heir." The next morning, the world was unnervingly quiet. When Evelyn arose, her cheek a canvas of purple and blue, she found Silas packing supplies. The sun was a pale, watery light on the horizon, barely mustering the strength to break the gloom. He moved with a cold, methodical purpose, loading his rifle, tying bedrolls to his horse, and stuffing jerky and hardtack into his saddlebags. He did not look at her. Only when he was finished did he turn, his face as blank and unforgiving as a winter sky. The flatness in his eyes terrified her more than his anger had the night before. This was not the heat of rage, this was the cold of absolute indifference. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "And you're not coming with me." Evelyn's heart slammed against her ribs. "Silas, no. This cabin, the land, none of it matters without a rightful heir," he continued, speaking as if she hadn't made a sound. "I'm heading south. Meet up with some ranchers near the Colorado line. Maybe I'll find the luck I deserve there." He finally looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her bruised face without a flicker of remorse. "You can stay here and rot for all I care. Just know that you and that thing, you've ruined everything." Panic clawed at her throat. She pleaded with him, her voice breaking as she reminded him of their vows, of their child's needs, of the promises he had made. He only tightened his jaw. He stepped forward, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he would strike her again. Instead, he shoved her, a brutal, dismissive push that sent her crashing into the table. The edge of it dug sharply into her ribs, and her head swam. He wrenched his rifle from its resting place on the wall, took one last, cold glance at the crying infant in the cradle, and strode out the door without looking back. Half numb with shock, Evelyn clutched Aurora, tears streaming silently down her face. When she heard the thunder of his horse's hooves galloping away, fading into the vast, empty silence of the plains, she let out a keening wail, a sound of such profound grief and desolation she had never known herself capable of. Her spirit felt torn in two. She was abandoned, alone, with a newborn child, in a remote cabin, at the mercy of a world that had just shown her its cruelest face. The silence Silas left behind was a living entity. It pressed in from the plains, filled the corners of the cabin, and echoed the frantic, terrified beating of Evelyn's own heart. For the first day, she was paralyzed, moving through a fog of shock and disbelief. She would find herself staring at the door, half expecting him to ride back, his anger spent, a flicker of the man she thought she had married returning to his eyes. But the horizon remained empty. The only sounds were the cry of the wind and the whimpers of her daughter. Desperation was a slow, creeping chill that finally broke through her stupor. She looked at Aurora, so small and helpless, and a primal fire ignited in the pit of her stomach. She was a mother. She would not let her child perish in this desolate place. She took inventory of their meager pantry, a sack of cornmeal, a half-empty jar of dried beans, a few strips of jerky. It was a death sentence measured in spoonfuls. Without a horse, the nearest settlement was a multi-day walk, an impossible journey for a woman still healing from childbirth with an infant in her arms. But staying was not an option. Winter was not a distant threat, but a hungry wolf already sniffing at the door, its breath visible in the crisp morning air. For several days, she managed. She rationed the food with painstaking care, her own hunger, a constant, gnawing ache she ignored in favor of keeping up her strength to nurse Aurora. She gathered firewood, her movements clumsy and slow, her body screaming in protest. Each evening, she would cradle her daughter by the faint glow of the hearth, singing lullabies into the oppressive darkness, her voice a thin thread of defiance against the overwhelming silence. Aurora, who had never known a father's warmth, was comforted by her mother's heartbeat, a steady rhythm of love in a world that had offered none. But the wilderness was not empty. It held dangers far older and more immediate than starvation or cold. One frigid dawn, as a silvery gloom still clung to the land, Evelyn went outside to fetch water from the creek. The air was sharp enough to sting her lungs. As she knelt by the water's edge, a shape detached itself from the shadows near the cabin. It was a man, unshaven and gaunt, his clothes little more than rags, and a wild, desperate look in his eyes. He was a spectre of the frontier's harsh realities, a man who had been chewed up and spat out by the very land Silas had sought to conquer. He brandished a dull-bladed knife, its edge catching the faint morning light. "You alone, woman?" he asked, his voice a dry crackle, laced with either madness or starvation. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. She scrambled backward, her mind racing. The cabin door was too far. Aurora was inside, alone and vulnerable. She tried to lie, to invent a husband who was out hunting, but her terror was a scent he could likely smell. The man advanced, his eyes darting toward the cabin. "Heard a baby crying," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Where's your food? Blankets? Got anything of value?" "We have next to nothing," Evelyn managed, her voice a faint whisper. "We're just a mother and child." The man snarled, his patience gone. He lunged. Instinct, raw and fierce, took over. Evelyn threw up her arm to protect her face. The blade, though dull, sliced across her forearm, and pain, sharp and blinding, tore through her. She saw stars dance before her eyes as warm blood dribbled down her sleeve. But the pain ignited something else, a mother's rage. Frantic to protect her baby, she screamed not a cry of fear, but a roar of defiance. She kicked out with all her might, her worn boot catching the intruder squarely in the shin. He stumbled, cursing in surprise and pain. Her ferocity seemed to spook him. He was a predator who had expected a sheep and found a wolf. He scrambled back into the half-lit brush and vanished as quickly as he had appeared. Bleeding and shaking, Evelyn staggered back inside. She slammed the door and barred it, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She pressed a rag to the wound, tears flooding her cheeks, tears not just from the pain, but from the terrifying, absolute realization of their vulnerability. If she stayed, more desperados would come, or the winter would claim them, or sickness. There was no choice left. Survival was no longer a matter of enduring, it was a matter of escaping. By midday, the decision was made. She wrapped her arm as best she could with strips of a clean chemise. The cut was deep and throbbed with a life of its own. She bundled Aurora tightly, securing her to her chest with a makeshift sling, her daughter's warmth a small comfort against the cold dread in her soul. Taking only a small pouch with the last of the cornmeal and a water skin, she set out on foot. Her destination was a faint hope. A wagon trail she knew lay somewhere to the east, a trail that led toward the settlement near Red Butte. Each step was agony. The wound in her arm throbbed in time with her frantic pulse. Her postpartum body, which had not been given time to heal, ached with a deep, bone-weary pain. But the resolve of a mother, fueled by sheer desperation, drove her forward. The journey was brutal. A high wind scoured her face with dust and grit, and the rocky ground tore at the thin soles of her shoes. Days blurred into a haze of walking, nursing, and shivering through the cold nights. She grew weaker, her milk thinning, her steps faltering. The wound on her arm grew hot and angry, the edges turning a dark, ominous red. Fever began to cloud her vision, making the vast landscape swim and shimmer before her eyes. She talked to Aurora constantly, her voice raspy and faint. "We're going to make it, my love. Just a little further. You'll see. There are good people in this world. There have to be." By the time she caught sight of Red Butte's jagged formation on the distant horizon, a smear of rust against the pale sky, she was walking on sheer will. Her vision swam with feverish spots, and the world began to tilt. And then she collapsed. She fell into the dust of the trail, the vast, empty sky blotting out the last of her consciousness. The final sound in her ears was not the wind, but the thin, terrified wail of her baby. Consciousness returned not as a sudden jolt, but as a slow, gentle tide. The first thing Evelyn felt was the cool, soothing touch of hands on her fevered arm. They were not the rough, menacing hands of the intruder, but something else entirely skilled, careful, and compassionate. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy as stones, and the harsh glare of the sun was filtered through a canopy of what looked like hide. Her vision cleared, and she was looking up into a man's face. It was a face unlike any she had ever seen up close, with strong, chiseled features, skin the hue of bronzed earth, and eyes as dark and deep as a forest at midnight. His hair was long and black, braided and decorated with small, intricate beads that caught the light. He wore a buckskin shirt and leggings adorned with fringe and patterns that spoke of a culture rich with meaning. His expression was one of measured, serious concern. Beside him stood two other figures. One was an older woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, with silver strands woven into her dark braids. The other was a young girl, perhaps 14 or 15, who was holding a water gourd with a shy but curious expression. Evelyn swallowed, her throat as dry as dust, and tried to speak. Only a raw, desperate croak emerged. The man hushed her softly, his voice a low, calming rumble. He introduced himself with a name that sounded to her ears like Talon. He spoke English, his words careful and measured, with an accent that shaped the language into something new and melodic. He told her she was safe, that he had found her on the plains, half dead from fever, cradling an infant whose cries had led him to her. Talon, as she soon learned, was a warrior of the Cheyenne people, respected for his skill as a hunter and his wisdom in council. The older woman was his mother, Whispering Willow, a healer whose knowledge of the earth's remedies was now mending Evelyn's infected wound with a poultice of herbs that smelled of sage and damp soil. The younger girl, Little Fawn, hovered near the small bundle that was Aurora, cooing in admiration and wonder at the pale-skinned baby. The Cheyenne had set up a temporary camp beside a hidden creek, a small cluster of hide shelters and a cooking fire that sent a thin curl of smoke into the sky. Days passed in a haze of healing. Evelyn's fever, which had brought her to the brink of death, finally broke under Whispering Willow's care. As her strength slowly returned, she pieced together what had happened. Talon, scouting ahead of his traveling family, had been drawn by Aurora's cries to the rock outcropping where Evelyn had collapsed. He had seen the faint breath of life still in her, and, despite the growing friction between settlers and the native tribes, had chosen compassion over caution. He had brought her and her child back to his camp, risking his own safety to save them. When Evelyn was finally strong enough to sit up and tried to thank him, her voice quavered with an emotion so deep it left her breathless. He merely inclined his head, his dark eyes holding a profound empathy that belied all the fearful stereotypes she had heard about the so-called savage tribes. "Your child needed you," he said simply. "She would have no mother if you died. The Great Spirit does not ask the color of a hand that is offered in help." In that simple statement, Evelyn felt a wave of shame for the prejudices she had unconsciously held. These people, who her own kind so often feared and scorned, had shown her a humanity more profound than any she had known from Silas. Whispering Willow taught her, through a mixture of gestures and Talon's translations, how to grind medicinal roots. Little Fawn, utterly enchanted with Aurora, became the baby's devoted guardian, fashioning a small toy from soft leather and feathers and singing Cheyenne lullabies that were as soothing as the bubbling creek. Aurora, who had known nothing but fear and cold since her birth, blossomed in their care, smiling and gurgling at the gentle faces around her. As Evelyn's strength grew, an unexpected warmth bloomed in her chest. Each evening, Talon would return from hunting with fresh game, and they would all share a meal around the fire. He would speak of his people's ways, of the spirits of the land and the sky, and of the sorrow he felt watching the great buffalo herds disappear. Evelyn, in turn, found herself telling him about her childhood, about her love for the land, and hesitantly about the betrayal that had cast her out into the wilderness. She never mentioned Silas by name, only referring to him as "my husband." But Talon listened with a quiet, unwavering attention that made her feel seen and heard for the first time in years. One afternoon, as the autumn sun stretched long shadows across the grass, Talon returned from a hunt with a young deer. Evelyn insisted on helping prepare the meat and hide, determined to contribute, to prove her gratitude. Though her stomach churned at the unfamiliar task, Whispering Willow guided her hands with patient kindness, and she persevered. Later, as she was washing the blood from her hands in the cold, clear water of the creek, Talon approached quietly and knelt beside her. He watched as the red swirls disappeared downstream. After a long moment of shared silence, he spoke. "You are learning. You are strong." Heat rose to Evelyn's cheeks. She murmured a shy thank you, trying to convey the depth of her indebtedness. He shook his head. "We do not keep account of debts and favors. We are people of the earth. We help each other. It is the only way to survive." He reached into a small pouch at his side and pulled out a thin strip of leather, adorned with a single, carved bone bead. With solemn care, he tied it around her wrist. "We will call you Aoist," he said, pronouncing the Cheyenne words slowly so she could repeat them. When she looked at him in confusion, he explained, "It means brave star. You came to us from the darkness, shining with life to protect your child. You have a warrior's courage." Tears brimmed in Evelyn's eyes, blurring his strong, kind face. No one had ever called her brave. Silas had only ever called her weak. In his gesture, she felt not just acceptance, but respect, a feeling she had never truly received from her own husband. Feeling emboldened by his kindness, she looked at him, her heart full. "My daughter's name is Aurora," she said softly. "I named her for the dawn, for a new beginning." Talon nodded in approval, repeating the name with care. "Aurora, it is a good name." In that moment, under the vast, open sky, surrounded by the golden grass of the plains, Evelyn felt something fundamental shift within her. The frontier was still fraught with danger, and her future was a terrifying, unwritten page. But for the first time since she'd left her family home, she felt like she had found solid ground. It was not the land Silas had claimed, but the quiet, profound humanity of the people who truly belonged to it. The fragile peace Evelyn found in the Cheyenne camp was like a delicate desert flower, beautiful, tenacious, but vulnerable to the harsh winds of the world beyond their secluded creek. That world was growing increasingly hostile. Word reached them through scouts and whispers on the wind. The conflict between the indigenous inhabitants and the white settlers was boiling over. U.S. cavalry units were patrolling the region with aggressive frequency, their movements sharp and purposeful. Cattle ranchers near Fort Laramie, their voices amplified by newspapers and telegraphs, blamed the Cheyenne for stolen livestock, ignoring the fact that their vast herds trampled sacred hunting grounds and drank the creeks dry. Skirmishes erupted like wildfire, leaving casualties and bitterness on both sides. Talon's band was a small one, a family group traveling to meet with other clans for the winter gathering. Their presence here was meant to be temporary, a quiet passage through the land of their ancestors. But now, every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every dust cloud on the horizon a potential enemy. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the sky, a rider approached their camp. It was not a Cheyenne scout. He rode under a makeshift flag of truce, a white cloth tied to the end of his rifle. Talon and several other men met him at the edge of the camp, their faces wary, their hands never far from their weapons. Evelyn watched from the opening of her shelter, her heart hammering against her ribs. She recognized the rider's wiry frame and the familiar, nervous posture even before he was close enough to see clearly. It was Corporal Elias Vance, the young soldier who had traveled with their wagon train for a time, the one who had offered her a kind word when Silas was at his worst. He was not alone. A handful of cavalry troopers remained at a distance, their figures stark silhouettes against the fading light, a clear and intimidating show of force. Elias dismounted, his movements stiff. He spoke to Talon, his voice strained, delivering a formal message from his commanding officer. The U.S. Army demanded the Cheyenne cease all movement through the territory without official permission. He also warned that local ranchers, emboldened by the Army's presence, were forming vigilante groups to deal with hostiles. Evelyn's stomach churned. She knew what that meant. It was a license for prejudice and violence, unchecked by law or morality. Then, Elias's eyes scanned the camp and landed on her. They widened in disbelief, a flicker of shock followed by profound confusion. He clearly had not expected to find a white woman, a woman he had presumed was either safe in her cabin or, more likely, dead living among the Cheyenne. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He approached her cautiously, lowering his rifle. "My God, we heard. Word was that your husband abandoned you. We thought you were lost." A flush of shame and anger washed over her at the mention of Silas and the life she had escaped. She stepped forward, Aurora held securely in her arms. "The story is true, Corporal," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I was left to die. Talon and his family saved my life and my daughter's." Elias looked profoundly uneasy. He glanced from her to Talon, who stood like a statue, carved from stone, his dark eyes unreadable. The soldier's duty warred with his decency. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and urgent, "you need to come back with me, for your own safety. Tensions are at a breaking point. A settler woman in a Cheyenne camp. Some will see you as a hostage. Others," he hesitated, "might see you as a traitor." His logic was a cold, sharp blade. She understood the danger. Her presence here could be the very spark that ignited the dry tinder of conflict. But the thought of leaving, of returning to the world of men like Silas, of putting herself and Aurora at the mercy of the fort's cold bureaucracy, felt like a betrayal of a different kind. She remembered the cruelty of her husband and the indifference of the settler community. The Cheyenne had shown her a kindness and respect she had never known. This small, nomadic camp felt more like home than the solid log cabin had ever been. Torn, she looked at Talon, a silent question in her eyes. He met her gaze and gave a solemn nod, guiding her a few steps away from Elias's hearing. "He speaks a hard truth," Talon said, his voice a low murmur. "The white soldiers want to force us onto barren land, away from the graves of our ancestors. They do not honor the treaties. If they see you here, they will think we have captured you. It will give them the excuse they seek to attack." Evelyn's heart pounded. She could not be the cause of more bloodshed. She could not bring ruin upon the people who had rescued her. "What should I do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Talon's gaze held a quiet, steady warmth that calmed her frantic heart. "We will protect you if you stay, Aoist. You and the little one are part of our circle now, but this is your choice. If you wish to go, I will not stop you." Elias's voice cut in from behind them, impatient and laced with fear. "Mrs. Blackwood, please, think of your child." His eyes darted nervously toward the armed Cheyenne warriors who watched them in tense silence. In that charged, suspended moment, with the fate of so many resting on her decision, Evelyn made a choice that would sever the last ties to her old life. She took a step away from Elias Vance and stood closer to Talon, a small but definitive movement. She looked directly at the soldier. "Thank you for your concern, Corporal, but my place is here." A tense, heavy silence followed. Elias exhaled a shaky breath, a look of profound regret on his face. "I can't guarantee your safety," he warned one last time. But Evelyn stood firm, her baby cradled protectively in her arms. She looked at Talon, and in the deep, unwavering resolve of his eyes, she felt something akin to destiny weaving their fates together. She was no longer just a survivor, she had chosen a side, she had chosen a family. News in the West traveled on the wind, carried by trappers, soldiers, and merchants, transforming from rumor to fact as it passed from one outpost to the next. The tale of the abandoned wife of Silas Blackwood, miraculously found living among the Cheyenne, became a sensation. But the story that reached Silas was a twisted, poisoned version of the truth, shaped by the very pride that had driven him to abandon her in the first place. He was in a saloon near the Colorado border, cultivating new alliances with wealthy ranchers, when he first heard it. He was rebuilding his narrative, casting himself as a man wronged by fate, a husband whose delicate wife had been too weak for the frontier and had tragically perished. The sympathy he received was a balm to his wounded ego. Then a scout, fresh from the north, brought the news. A Corporal Vance from Fort Laramie had found a white woman, his woman in a Cheyenne camp. The whispers in the saloon were immediate and cruel. She hadn't died, she had run off. She had chosen savages over him. Silas's carefully constructed world of victimhood shattered. The sympathy in the room curdled into snickers and sidelong glances. His legacy was no longer one of tragic loss, but of humiliating cuckoldry. In his mind, Evelyn's survival was not a miracle. It was a betrayal. Her choice to remain with the Cheyenne was not an act of self-preservation. It was a public declaration of his failure as a man, as a husband. The humiliation was a physical burn, hotter and more painful than any branding iron. His wounded pride festered into a dark and obsessive rage. He could not allow this story to be his legacy. He had to reclaim what was his, not out of love or remorse, but out of a desperate need to rewrite the narrative. He would not be the man whose wife left him for an Indian. He would be the hero who rescued her from captivity. He rode north with a grim determination, using his wealth and influence to secure a meeting. He convinced a reluctant captain at Fort Laramie that his wife was clearly a hostage, her mind perhaps twisted by her ordeal. He insisted on a parley, a chance to bring her back to civilization. Corporal Elias Vance, who knew the truth of the situation, was ordered to escort him, a task he accepted with a heavy heart. They found the Cheyenne camp nestled in a grove of cottonwoods. When Silas saw Evelyn, his heart did not leap with relief, but constricted with a cold, possessive fury. She was different. Her skin was tanned by the sun, her movements were more confident, and she wore the simple leather bracelet Talon had given her. She held their daughter, Aurora, who looked healthy and alert. But what galled him most was the way she stood near Talon, a quiet and unbreakable solidarity radiating between them. Elias dismounted, raising a hand in a gesture of peace. "We're here under truce," he called out, "to speak with Mrs. Blackwood." Silas, however, remained on his horse, looking down on them all as if from a throne. His glare was fixed on Evelyn, a look of such contempt it made her blood run cold. With a nod from Talon, Evelyn gathered her courage and stepped forward. Aurora clutched to her chest like a shield. "Evelyn," Silas began, his voice deceptively calm, a chilling imitation of the man who had once courted her. "This farce has gone on long enough. It's time to come home." The hypocrisy of his words was breathtaking. Home? The place where he had struck her and left her to die? Her blood boiled. "I have no home with you," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "You left us, Silas. You left us for dead. Our daughter was nothing to you." His eyes flickered to the child in her arms, his lip curling in a faint sneer. "I may have acted rashly," he conceded, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The pressures of this land, they can make a man do things. But I can't have my wife, the mother of my child, embarrassing me by living like a squaw among heathens. It tarnishes my name, my standing." He looked around, his gaze sweeping over the Cheyenne with undisguised scorn. "I can make your life comfortable again, Evelyn, but you have to leave this filth behind." The sheer audacity of his offer, devoid of any real apology or love, was almost laughable. "I would rather die," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength, "than go back to a man who raised his hand against me and abandoned his own daughter." She shifted protectively, her body a physical barrier between him and Aurora. Before Silas could retort, Elias intervened, his tone urgent. "Blackwood, that's enough. We are here to broker a peaceful resolution." He turned to Evelyn. "Ma'am, the army. I am not his wife any more." Evelyn cut in, her heart pounding. "I will not be returning with him." The finality in her voice hung in the air. Silas's face, which had been a mask of strained civility, twisted into the ugly, snarling visage she remembered from that last terrible night. He had offered her a chance to restore his honor, and she had thrown it back in his face, in front of witnesses. "Then you're a traitor," he spat, the word dripping with venom. "By God, you've made your choice. The army won't protect you now. No one will." He yanked on his horse's reins, swinging the animal around so violently it reared up. Elias hesitated, meeting Evelyn's pleading eyes. She saw regret in his expression, the look of a good man trapped by his duty. Finally, he remounted and rode off with Silas. Talon, who had watched the entire exchange in stony silence, stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Evelyn's shoulder. The simple gesture was an anchor, a reminder that she was not alone in facing Silas's wrath. But as they watched the riders disappear over the rise, a cold dread churned in her stomach. She knew Silas. She knew the depths of his pride. This was not over. He had not come to get her back. He had come to erase a humiliation, and since she had refused to be the symbol of his redemption, she and everyone who protected her would now become the target of his vengeance. Silas Blackwood did not just bring vengeance, he brought a plague. Fueled by a righteous fury that was far more potent than the truth, he rode from one settlement to the next, his story crystallizing into a dark legend. He was no longer a failed husband, but a wronged victim, a man whose wife and child had been brutally abducted by Cheyenne savages. He painted a lurid picture of Evelyn as a captive, brainwashed and helpless, a damsel in need of rescuing. To the settlers, already primed by fear and prejudice, his narrative was not just believable, it was a call to arms. He gathered a posse, not of lawmen, but of vigilantes, ranch hands with old grudges, drifters spoiling for a fight, and men whose fear of the native tribes had curdled into a simmering hatred. They were a volatile and dangerous combination, a mob cloaked in the guise of a rescue party. The hawkish officer at Fort Laramie, Captain Roth, while not officially sanctioning the group, made it clear he would turn a blind eye. Silas Blackwood was a man of property and influence, and in the calculus of the frontier, his word weighed more than the lives of a wandering band of Cheyenne. Talon's scouts brought the news. A large party of armed white men was sweeping the territory, and their direction was unmistakable. There was no time to reason, no hope for a peaceful resolution. They had to run. The band decided to relocate further west into a rugged canyon where thick pine forests and jagged rock formations offered concealment. They traveled for 2 days, a frantic exodus up rocky trails and through narrow passes. Evelyn, with Aurora strapped securely to her chest in a carrier Little Fawn had made, trudged on with them. Her body ached, but she refused to be a burden. The fear in the air was a tangible thing, a low hum of anxiety that passed from the adults to the children, who now walked in hushed silence. On the 3rd morning, as the sun cast long, cool shadows across the canyon floor, chaos erupted. One of the scouts, perched high on a ridge, let out a sharp warning cry. In the distance, dust trails rose like angry spirits against the blue sky, armed riders approaching fast. "Scatter," Talon's voice cut through the morning, calm, sharp, and authoritative. "Into the rocks, find cover." The band dispersed like a flock of startled birds, scrambling up the rocky slopes. Evelyn clutched Aurora tight, her breath catching in her throat as Little Fawn grabbed her arm and guided her up a steep, gravelly incline. They were seeking refuge in the very bones of the earth, but their pursuers were not just hunting them, they were caging them. Smoke soon filled the air, acrid and suffocating. The vigilantes were setting fires at the canyon mouth, using the blaze to flush them out like animals. Flames licked at the dry pines, the crackle and roar growing into a deafening inferno. Gunshots echoed off the canyon walls, the sound sharp and deadly. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. She stumbled, nearly losing her footing on the loose scree, but Little Fawn's grip was firm. They crawled behind a massive boulder, hugging the ground as the world around them dissolved into a hell of smoke and noise. The baby, sensing the terror, began to whimper, a small, pathetic sound against the roar of the fire. Suddenly, a bullet ricocheted off the rock just inches from Evelyn's head, showering them with stone fragments. She stifled a scream, pressing her lips against Aurora's soft hair. Through a momentary parting in the smoke, she caught sight of the men on horseback below. They were a motley crew, some in ranchers' clothes, others in half-tattered uniforms. And then she saw him, Silas. His face was a grim mask of hate, his eyes scanning the rocks, his rifle at the ready. He was not a rescuer, he was a destroyer. He shouted orders to the others, urging them to push higher, to leave no rock unturned. Talon and a small group of Cheyenne warriors were trying to create a diversion, leading the main body of the vigilantes away from the women and children. Arrows hissed through the smoke, silent messengers of death. Some found their mark, unhorsing riders who fell with cries that were quickly swallowed by the inferno. But the attackers were relentless, their numbers and their firearms a brutal advantage. The fire leapt from tree to tree, turning the canyon into a furnace. The dense smoke strangled the daylight, and the roar of the blaze merged with the thunder of hooves and the crack of rifles. Evelyn's vision blurred with tears of smoke and terror. If not for Aurora's weight against her chest, a constant, living reminder of what she stood to lose, she might have collapsed under the sheer weight of her fear. She followed Little Fawn, stumbling over roots and rocks, until at last they reached a narrow ledge that overlooked a smoldering ravine. They crouched, coughing, their lungs burning, scanning for any path to safety. Amid the chaos, Talon emerged from the smoke, a ghost of motion. His shirt was singed, an arrow clutched in his hand. He beckoned for them to follow him along a treacherous trail that skirted the canyon's edge. It was their only way out. Just then, a single shot rang out, clearer and closer than the others. Evelyn saw him, Silas, perched on a ridge across the chasm, taking careful aim at Talon. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. She watched in abject horror as the muzzle of the rifle flashed. The bullet whipped past her ear with a sound like a furious insect. Talon staggered, a grunt of pain escaping his lips. He clutched his side, and a dark stain immediately began to spread across the buckskin. "No!" Evelyn cried, a raw, ragged sound torn from her soul. She lurched toward him as he sank to his knees, his face contorted in pain, though he fought to remain upright. Another shot chipped the rock behind them. Little Fawn screamed in panic, urging them forward. Somehow, with desperation fueling every breath, Evelyn and Little Fawn managed to pull Talon to his feet. Leaning heavily on them, his body a dead weight, he gasped, "Keep going." The canyon floor was a blazing inferno. The route behind them was blocked. Their only choice was to climb higher, away from the worst of the fire. They half-carried, half-dragged him, praying the thick smoke would conceal them from Silas's view. It was a grueling, desperate climb, each step jostling the bullet wound in Talon's side, his blood leaving a dark trail on the dusty rocks. Finally, they reached a ridge thick with pines that the flames had not yet devoured. They collapsed behind a fallen log, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. Talon's breathing was shallow and labored, blood seeping between the fingers he pressed to his side. With trembling hands, Evelyn tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it to the wound. Little Fawn, tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks, whispered frantic prayers in Cheyenne. Aurora, overwhelmed by the terror and chaos, began to cry, her wails echoing eerily through the smoky pine grove. Evelyn tried to hush her, pressing a kiss to the baby's forehead. Exhausted, drenched in sweat and smoke, she glanced at Talon's face. Despite the pain etched there, he reached out and placed his hand gently over hers, his grip surprisingly strong. In that moment, amid the flames of violence and the terror of pursuit, something unspoken passed between them, a promise that not even the darkest cruelty could shatter. Night fell, but it brought no darkness, only a suffocating, orange twilight. From their hiding place high on the ridge, they could see the canyon below, a glowing cauldron of embers and dying flames. The roar had subsided into a mournful crackle, and the air was thick with the stench of burnt pine and sorrow. The vigilantes, driven back by the very inferno they had created, were gone. Evelyn prayed the rest of the Cheyenne band had escaped, but in the hollow pit of her stomach she feared the terrible cost of this day. Her immediate world had shrunk to this small, precarious refuge. Little Fawn, her youthful face aged by the horrors she had witnessed, tended to Talon with a knowledge passed down through generations. She found yarrow leaves, chewing them into a rough poultice to pack into the wound, her movements deft and sure despite her trembling hands. But Talon was fading. The bullet was lodged deep, and the blood loss had left him pale and disoriented. A fever began to take hold, its heat radiating from his skin. As he drifted in and out of a delirious state, a profound and terrifying fear gripped Evelyn. The man who had been her rock, her savior, was now as fragile as a flickering candle flame. She could not lose him. The thought was unbearable, a personal abyss she could not face. By morning, a thick layer of ash coated the canyon, a gray shroud over a blackened graveyard of trees. The immediate threat of Silas and his men seemed to have passed, likely assuming that any survivors had fled far away. Slowly, painfully, They began their trek. It was not a flight, but a desperate search for sanctuary. They moved westward, away from the settled lands, deeper into the wilderness. They walked for hours, stopping every few minutes to let Talon rest. At times, Evelyn and Little Fawn had to half-carry him, his weight a testament to the life they were fighting to save. Each step he took was a monumental act of will, his face a stoic mask, hiding the agony beneath. By midday, they stumbled into a small, hidden valley, a sanctuary shielded by tall cliffs. A ribbon of clear water flowed through it, and a grove of cottonwood trees offered shade and shelter. It felt like a gift from the spirits Talon had spoken of. They collapsed near the creek, their journey over for now. The days that followed were a blur of focused survival. Little Fawn foraged for medicinal plants along the creek banks, her knowledge of the land their only pharmacy. Evelyn, pushing back the fear that threatened to swallow her whole, sat by Talon's side, whispering to him. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she spoke anyway, her voice a steady, comforting murmur. She told him about her childhood farm, about the scent of rain on dry earth, and the gentleness of her parents. She confessed her fear that she would never truly be free of Silas's wrath. And she told him over and over how grateful she was, how he had shown her what true strength and kindness looked like. "You have to live, Talon," she whispered, her tears falling onto his feverish hand. "You have to. For your people. For me." During one of his brief, lucid moments, he reached for her hand, his gaze intense, though clouded with pain. "If I do not live," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper, "you must go on. Take Aurora. Teach her to walk two paths, Cheyenne and White. Do not let that man. Do not let him take her." Tears pricked Evelyn's eyes. She squeezed his hand gently. "I won't let him have her," she vowed, her voice cracking with emotion. She paused, then added with a surge of fierce determination, "And you will live. I will not allow you to die." Bit by bit, her sheer will seemed to have an effect. Greybird's herbal treatments kept the worst of the infection at bay. Evelyn helped him sip water and broth made from the small rabbits Little Fawn managed to snare. At night, while Little Fawn slept, Evelyn would place cool, damp cloths on his forehead, humming the lullabies she now sang to Aurora, hoping the simple melodies would soothe the fire inside him. During this slow, painstaking recovery, the bond between them deepened, transforming from gratitude into something far more profound. In the quiet of the valley, stripped of all pretense, she saw the man, not just the warrior. She watched the graceful slope of his cheekbone in the half-light, the quiet strength in his hands even as they trembled with weakness. He, in turn, seemed to see past the frightened refugee to the brave star he had named her. When he was lucid, his gaze would follow her, a gentle warmth in his eyes that spoke volumes. One twilight, as the sky turned pink and gold behind the cliffs, he was finally strong enough to sit up, leaning against a cottonwood tree. Evelyn sat beside him, mending a tear in Aurora's blanket. The comfortable silence between them was broken when he reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. His touch was as light as a feather, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her entire being. "Your spirit is strong, Aust," he said, his voice low and still weak, but clear. "It is a bright fire. I think it guided me back from the darkness." Warmth flooded her cheeks. Uncertain how to respond, she simply leaned closer, letting her eyes convey the gratitude, the affection, the hope that was welling inside her. In that unspoken moment, their bond was sealed, transcending the barriers of language, culture, and the scars they both bore. They were two survivors from two different worlds who had found in each other a solace as profound and necessary as the water that flowed through their hidden valley. Life in the valley could not last forever. It was a place of healing, a pause in a story that was not yet finished. As Talon's strength returned, the stark reality of their situation pressed in on them. Their supplies were dwindling, and the fate of Whispering Willow and the rest of their band was a constant, aching question in their hearts. One morning, as Talon tested his strength by drawing a small bow Little Fawn had crafted, a rider appeared on the ridge above the valley. Instinctively, they froze, the memory of the canyon attack a fresh, raw wound. But the rider was alone, and he carried something white on a stick, a makeshift flag. He descended cautiously into the valley, and as he drew closer, Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. It was Corporal Elias Vance. He dismounted, his face drawn and weary, his uniform dusty and travel-worn. He looked older than she remembered, the decency in his eyes now shadowed by a deep disillusionment. "I've been searching for you," he said, his voice quiet, addressing Evelyn but his gaze including Talon. "After the canyon, I left. I couldn't be a part of it anymore. I'm no longer a soldier." He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry for everything. I should have done more to stop them." Evelyn believed him, but the damage was done. "Why are you here, Elias?" she asked, her voice tight, with a mistrust she couldn't entirely suppress. He looked from her to Talon, a silent acknowledgement of the warrior's right to be a part of this conversation. "I came to warn you. Silas Blackwood isn't finished. He's rallying more men, telling anyone who will listen that you've been bewitched, that he has to kill the Cheyenne warrior who holds you captive to break the spell. He's obsessed. He says if he can't have you back, he'll make sure no one can have you." A cold sickness washed over Evelyn. She clutched Aurora, who was sleeping peacefully in her carrier, a symbol of everything Silas sought to destroy. The time for running was over. Silas would never stop. He would hunt them to the ends of the earth, his wounded pride a relentless, consuming fire. Talon's eyes narrowed. He placed a hand on the hilt of his knife. "We will not run like frightened deer," he said, his voice calm but infused with cold steel. "This land is our home." They all understood the weight of that statement. A confrontation was inevitable. It was not a choice, but a destiny that had been set in motion the moment Silas's pride had shattered. If he insisted on a final reckoning, they would not face him as fugitives, they would face him on their own terms. With Elias as their guide and reluctant intermediary, they chose the place, a wide plateau overlooking the jagged formation of Red Butte, a place of open ground where there could be no ambushes, no hiding. Elias rode ahead, pretending to broker one last, desperate meeting, drawing Silas and his posse to the chosen spot. By sunset, they were in position. The tall grasses shimmered in the amber light as Silas and his rough collection of men waited in a crescent formation, their rifles ready. Evelyn rode beside Talon. His posture was straight and proud, betraying nothing of the healing wound that still ached in his side. She had Aurora strapped to her chest, her heart a frantic drum against the baby's back. Little Fawn was hidden in the rocks nearby, her bow drawn, a silent, deadly protector. Silas stepped forward, the setting sun glinting off the barrel of his rifle. Contempt was carved deep into his face. "You came," he sneered. "I came to end this," Evelyn replied, her voice ringing out across the plateau, clear and strong. "You are not taking me, and you are not taking my daughter. We are not your property." One of Silas's men scoffed. "That's your husband's child, woman. He has every right." "He gave up that right when he left her to die," Evelyn snapped back. Silas's sneer curled as he looked past her to Talon. "You think you can just ride off with a savage and live happily ever after? This is the real world, Evelyn." He raised his voice, a final, cruel proclamation. "If I can't have you, I'll see you both dead, right here." "Silas, enough," Elias intervened, his own rifle held low but ready. "Stand down." "You coward," Silas spat at him. "You'd betray your own kind for her." She is more my kind than you will ever be." Talon's voice cut through the tension, deep and resonant. "Harm her, and you will answer to me." Everything froze. In that suspended moment, Silas made his choice. He raised his rifle, aiming not at Talon, but directly at Evelyn and the child on her chest. A whistle cut through the silence. An arrow, swift and true, launched from Little Fawn's bow. It struck Silas's hand, burying itself deep. His shot went wild, exploding harmlessly into the sky. In the next heartbeat, the world erupted. Elias fired, downing one of the vigilantes who had raised his own weapon. Evelyn yanked her horse around, riding for the cover of the rocks, shielding Aurora with her body. Talon dismounted with fluid grace, closing the distance between himself and Silas in a blur of motion. They rolled in the dust, a desperate, grunting struggle. Silas, enraged and wounded, broke free. He slammed the heavy butt of his rifle into Talon's side, striking the old wound. Talon cried out, staggering back. Silas stood over him, raising the weapon like a club for a final, killing blow. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She didn't think. She acted. She drew the revolver Elias had given her for protection, a weapon she had prayed she would never use. Her hand was steady. Her aim was true. She fired. The shot cracked across the plains. Silas collapsed, clutching his chest, a look of utter disbelief on his face. His eyes locked with Evelyn's one last time, a flash of shock, of fury, of a life built on pride crumbling to dust. And then the light drained from them. Silence fell, sudden and absolute, leaderless and shocked. The rest of Silas's men scattered, melting away into the twilight. Evelyn slid from the saddle, her legs weak, and rushed to Talon's side. He was alive, injured, but already pushing himself to his feet. Hope, awakened by the chaos, began to wail in her arms. Elias was beside them now, his face grim as he looked at Silas's body. Red Butte loomed in the distance, stained by the last light of a bloody sunset. The man who had once tried to control Evelyn's destiny now lay broken by her will to protect the family she had chosen. In the stunned silence, as Little Fawn emerged from the rocks, tears in her eyes, and embraced her, Evelyn knew it was over. She looked from the lifeless body of her former husband to the living, breathing warrior beside her, and then down at the crying child in her arms. Within days, the survivors of the Cheyenne band, led by a grieving but resilient Whispering Willow, found them. The reunions were tearful, the losses mourned. Plans were made to move west, away from the encroaching danger. Elias, a man without a country, chose to ride with them. Beneath the vast, star-filled skies of her new world, with Talon at her side and Aurora safe in her arms, Evelyn had finally found peace. She was Aoist, the brave star, and she was finally home, in a family forged not by blood or by law, but by choice, by courage, and by a love that was as wild and resilient as the land itself.